You are listening to Key to the Bridge, brought to you by your friends at Keystone Therapy and Training Services, where we will be sharing human stories, talking about community resources, mental health, and wellness. This is a podcast for everyone. Welcome. All right, everyone. Welcome to Key to the Bridge. I'm really I think I'm always excited when we get together to have our conversations and chat. But I'm also always excited when somebody's coming to talk that I've known for a very long time. And so I was just excited this morning getting together. So welcome. Happy to have everybody here. So I'm Erica Bosque. I'm the CEO, Executive Director of Keystone Therapy and Training Services. And I'm also, I would say, the honored friend of our guest today and colleague. And so I'm going to let Miss Angela introduce herself. So Angela, can you tell us your name, a little bit about who you are, what you're doing in the world right now?
Yeah. Thanks, Erica. So my name is Angela Walsh-Tejeda. Let's see. I'm doing all kinds of things. So here at Keystone, I'm a therapist, part-time therapist. I work at one of the Roseland Middle School / high schools. And a little bit about me. So I got my master's in social welfare back in 2012 from UC Berkeley. I was a Title IV recipient, which meant that I got a full ride to go to Cal, contingent that I completed 2 years of child welfare. So I was already working in the child welfare area field at that time. And so, I applied to grad school. I was pregnant. I got in. I had a newborn. And so I was a new mom, and I was going to graduate school. So I got my MSW, got my PPSC. And I've worked within a lot of different social work fields. My passion is within the substance abuse community here within Sonoma County. That's definitely my niche. I'm really passionate about substance use disorder related everything within the recovery sphere. Yeah.
Everything within the recovery sphere. Wow, that's amazing. So I wanted to have you come here today because I think that growing up in Sonoma County, and I don't think Sonoma County is super unique. There's a lot of rural suburbia places in the world. Mm-hmm. And we're at a time right now where I know for myself, I'm trying to figure out what the substance use / addiction culture is looking like and how is it going and how, yes, it's affecting the communities we serve. Yes. And I think there's this historical piece that's starting to creep in. We were warming up for this and I was thinking, moving into your 40s, I think there just starts to be this retrospective piece around what did it look like when I was a young person? What did it look like when I was in my 20s? And, coming off parents who, the boomers who I think did, sex, drugs, and rock and roll in their own way. Mm-hmm. And what it's starting to look like now. And our county is starting to have, I think it's more noticeable impact of what substance use and addiction is looking like. I don't think it's new. I just think we know more about it. Yeah. And so I was thinking about our personal history. And I think that's something when we're talking about substance use and addiction that most of the time we're talking about what other people are doing and we're not necessarily talking about our own history or connection. And I come from a family of people who suffered from some form of addiction and some of it was functional and some of it was not. And it's maybe a soft joke, but my drug of choice is sugar. We all have these things that we definitely enjoy, probably sugar and laughing. Those are my serious, a lot of fun, loving all of that. Dancing too. Probably some things
definitely dancing.
Yeah, dancing. I mean, things that just make you feel really good. And so I'm wondering, as we're trying to figure out what we're doing next and how things are going, as you have been doing work in this community, both personally and professionally, what you're noticing or reflecting on in regards to any and all the things that are going on with this massive umbrella that we're now talking about?
Yeah.
That's a big question, but
Great
just like
question.
thoughts.
Yeah, well, so like my sociological brain, so I have my undergraduate degree in sociology. So I'm always looking at the micro, meso, macro. Like that's just like my lens of how I approach social work, how I approach therapy. And so, yeah, so I'll just give an example. So this morning, I drove my daughter to Beverly Hillsburg. I kind of joke, Beverly Hillsburg. Very, very wealthy part of our county. And so I was driving in there and I was just thinking, I was thinking about, we're going to do this podcast this morning. And I was just thinking about how, Sonoma County, we are known for wine, cannabis, and breweries, right?
Yes, we're definitely into the stimulants of some kind.
Most definitely. And so it's like, not to get bleak really quick, but like, there's a lot of like social media, Instagram reels, right? That's all about like Sonoma County and like visit these places, right? And like right now, our community is experiencing severe overdose, specifically of teenagers, right? And so again, I think there's this gap of like Sonoma County is this very wealthy, people come from all over the world, and yet within our community, like we're dealing with some really serious issues connected to substance abuse. And so anyway, so I just kind of like wanted to start with that because I think that there's this disconnect. What I'm really what I love about recovery is that, alcoholism, drug addiction, it does not discriminate. So it doesn't matter class, race, sexuality, gender, background. Like substance abuse impacts everyone. And so like that is what I think like we just kind of need to like remember. It doesn't matter, how much money you have or like these are issues that impact us across the board.
Yeah. I mean, wine, weed, and beer being the place where we grow up, it's really interesting because I do think there was, at least growing up here, there was definitely a normalization of alcohol. Like alcohol everywhere all the time, which I don't think is super unique, but I also think that when you literally make it in your county constantly, which I think maybe helps with some stigma around, okay, cool, if you're going to do something, maybe try it and see how it's going to work. But I also think at the same time, when we were growing up, cannabis was illegal. Mm-hmm. And so I think about growing up in basically the abstinence model, right? Mm-hmm. Like say no to drugs.
Yes.
I was thinking about the egg frying commercial this morning, getting ready for here. This is your brain on drugs, and like any questions. And I remember like that vivid. And I think people of our age group talk about that commercial. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking like, does stuff really fry your brain? Like, what are they talking about when they're talking about that egg? And at the time, it was also pretty serious. We were talking about crack cocaine. Mm-hmm. We were talking some about heroin and opioids. But then in this county, I just remember talking about weed, meth, alcohol, some cocaine. But it was still like very quiet. It was still very like not necessary, or it felt quiet. Like it was supposed to be a big secret. And then as cannabis became more accepted, I think having wine, weed, and beer being all accepted, it shifted some unique culture stuff here in this county in particular, because I think about how many substances people are on in Sonoma County in particular, wherever we go. And that my kids are now growing up where we've seen, I think about walking into a outdoor concert family thing we were going to this summer, and like there were people taking bong rips in the parking lot. Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow. And my kids are like, Mom, what are they doing? I'm like, well, that is one way to take, cannabis. And they're like, okay, like what, they're like, weed? I'm like, yep, you can eat it, you can smoke it, you can, and we're trying to figure out, I'm like, this is a different time of just exposure and like trying to think about how that works. And for us growing up, the secret part of it was a different way of being. And so I'm wondering too, when you're talking about how you're passionate about it and the work you're doing in the community, are you seeing and experiencing some shifts in the way that we talk about it and look at it? Or is it still very shame-based, like you're saying? Like, doesn't discriminate, but it's still very shame. Like, if you're if you're an addict, that word gets used a lot.
Yeah.
Then you're broken and you can't handle yourself. Like, what are some of the stigmas and things that you're still seeing?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's still a lot of stigma surrounding substance abuse for sure. And I think that there's different models that folks are using to address substance abuse related issues. There's the kind of like tough love, the sort of like old guard model where it's like, okay, like, and what was that? Sort of like a scared straight where it's like, like we're going to guilt you and shame you and intimidate you. I think that model can work for some people. I have seen it work. I've worked in a couple women's residential treatment centers. I have seen that work, but I think that for a lot of folks that have significant complex trauma, that approach, I think, is shifting to a more trauma-informed approach. And so it's like, okay, like let's meet the client where they're at. However, I also think like that there are certain models that I think can maybe be a little bit too catering as far as like co-signing on certain behaviors that like may not support the client in their recovery. So I guess I'll just say like there are a lot of different models and it's not a one size fits all. And so I also think that like, and I'll just use like this example. So the housing first model, which is like low barrier to entry. And so like my experience working with the unhoused population, there's a lot of federal funding right now to help folks. And so, however, I think that there can be a lot of power, like the power of transformation of when you have certain boundaries and like to support someone recovering. Like, and again, like, I think the other piece is like, does the client person even believe that they have an issue, right? I think that's kind of the other thing is like, is there a problem? Do they want to recover or not? Because people have to hit different kinds of bottoms. And so it's also like, is there even a willingness? Because not everybody wants to recover. I think people have different bottoms. Within the recovery community, it is, substance abuse leads to jails, institutions. That's usually right. There's some kind of like intersectionality between those systems where it's like, oh, the state's coming in, like I may have a problem. Right. And so I even think just like what people see as addiction, like varies, right? Because some people think that they can use recreational and they can use normally. And then there may be a threshold where people hit a certain point and they realize that all they know is more. And so they can't just do like have one drink or have like one drug. And nowadays with the fentanyl epidemic, people may think, oh, they're going to do a line of Coke and it's then laced. And so we're just in a time where like the lethality of SUD related issues compared to when we were in high school is very different because we don't know what is in the substances. Yes, there are like they have test strips, like there are different ways. But things really have changed.
Yeah, and I also think, too, there's also this discussion of what the definition of sobriety is. Mm-hmm. And I feel like when you're talking about those more rigid, I guess I'll use that word, structures of recovery in some way, right, that there is a lot of conversation now about the spectrum of sobriety and what that looks like for folks. And I do think that has a more harm reductive, trauma informed, trying to think about approach because everybody's going to be a little bit different in what their process looks like. And then I also think too, I know just as a provider working in the community, sometimes that makes it harder in some ways because the systems aren't necessarily interested in a range of care. You either are sick or you're well.
Yeah.
Right? Like you have to be one of those two things. Sure. You can't do anything in between. You're either sick or you're well. And that's really hard. It's really hard to maneuver that. And I think that I'll speak for myself, like when we were on shelter in place, during COVID, the amount, they have all the data. They were tracking that stuff. I think about alcohol sales in general.
Oh, yeah.
Right? shot up. I mean, I don't know. We were all at home. I don't know what people were doing. Well, I know what people were doing. I was there. People were doing a lot of things. I mean, they were mainly shopping and drinking.
Yeah.
I mean, those were the two main things that were going on. And I also think that era brought some technology into the mix of literally having lots of different types of substances being delivered to your house,
Most definitely.
which is also a shift in access in culture. Like, you don't have to go out to the scary places, you know, all these stereotypes of like where you have to go to get a substance. It gets dropped off at your door and you don't have to go anywhere. And I do think that is also shifting the conversation of what does it look like to care for your body or your community while doing whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that's part of the conversation that isn't necessarily happening.
Correct.
Right? That if we all have different levels of access now to different substances or different types of addiction, because the other thing that shot through the roof during shelter in place was technology, screen time.
Yep.
So I'll add that too. We were looking at screens.
Yes.
We were doing a lot of drinking and substances, and we were shopping, which is a ton of, I'll get a little science geeky right now, but that's a ton of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, like different things going on in your body to like get you to feel good. And I think it was a good example of a time where we probably all weren't feeling the best.
Yeah.
And we now have people coming still off of that. I still think there's like a shifting now too of people have some behaviors or habits of things that they've picked up, and they're like, I don't know when this started. And I'm like, well, what were you doing in 2019, in 2020?
Yeah.
And that is a shift. And then we have young people who also during that time had different experiences and exposure.
Most definitely.
I mean, and so I do think you're right. Things are different. I think about the amount of youth I'm talking to right now who are in high school who started eating cannabis during shelter in place.
Yep.
Because they had access usually from the adults that they were around, and the adults didn't even know necessarily that they were doing it.
Yeah.
But that's just different. Like, that's different to be able to like sneak a gummy
Oh, yeah.
before you hopped on your Zoom class
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
and not have to tell anyone.
Well, and the potency now, specifically of cannabis, is in a. It's very so. There's that. I wanted to go back to what you said about like you're either well or you're either sick, right? And so like this is where I get really fascinated with recovery because it's not a black or white issue. There's many shades of gray, and there's so much nuance within the recovery community, right? For some people. When I was working women's residential treatment, there were clients who would go to the methadone clinic. They would get their, Suboxone daily, right? So, like, there are different recovery models. And for some people, that harm reduction works. But, yeah, there are many shades of gray. And so it's not, are you sick or are you well, right? And so I think there can be some rigidity within recovery community of like, okay, people's recovery may look different. But at the same time, again, when there are people and there are, I was just looking at some of the statistics. I mean, so like yearly, there are about 500 ER visits related to substance abuse, overdose. In
Sonoma County?
Within Sonoma County, yeah.
So 500, on average, there's 500 ER visits a year due
per
to
year, yes.
Okay.
And then what I found on the Sonoma County website, there's approximately 44 accidental overdoses happening each year.
So you said 40?
County. 44.
It's interesting you say that number because I do not think our current, it's just fine. I mean, I get it. Our current media sources, I'm not reading about, maybe I am, or maybe I need to look better, but I don't feel like I'm reading about, let's say 40 to 50 overdoses a year in Sonoma County, accidental overdoses. And that probably has something to do with the majority of the people who, I'll say the, air quotes, the type of person who is overdosing versus other types of people who may be overdosing. So how do we know how we're doing if we're not really talking about all of it?
Yeah.
And 500 visits a year to the ER for substance-related, maybe overdose-related. Yeah, that is not a common that's not a common statistic that we're discussing. And
No,
I'm assuming,
absolutely not.
I'm guessing you and I, the researchers over here, I bet you that trend is up.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. And I think that's the other thing. Like, we know from being social workers, sociologists, right? Like, that usually there's a lot of underreporting.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's also like, who is making the reports? Like, what are their, just really looking at data. Where's the data coming from? Who's it funded by, right? Like, there's just all these different ways to look at, like, where is data coming from?
And you usually have to be really in trouble if you're going to go to the ER, if you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. Like that also too is, right, that's data that's almost impossible to capture. But I think about that as a young person, right? Like how many people I was around in high school who were probably having some form of alcohol poisoning.
Yes.
And we never took them to the ER. Why? Because we were around things that we weren't supposed to be around and no one wanted to get in trouble. So you kept an eye on them while they were on the bathroom floor.
Yep.
We gave them water in a bucket. We, like the things that we were doing just to make sure people were okay. But I think about that now, that we weren't really asking for help because we were so afraid to be in trouble.
Yeah.
And so, I do think that some of it is data also being taken on a topic that I don't feel like we had nearly as much interest or data going on when we were young folks.
No, absolutely not.
Younger folks.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't feel like that was the way it was rolling, because at that point in time too, talk about being well or sick, everything was predominantly an abstinence-based model. Like, just don't do it. Don't do drugs. I mean, basically, it was like, to a teenager, it felt like don't have any fun. Don't do drugs. Don't drink any alcohol. Don't have sex. Don't take any risks. And what are you going to do when you're a young person? You're going to do all those things.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah. Well, and then, there's teens experimenting, right? So then it's like, just not having conversation of like, whereas now it's like, okay, we need to have talks, and we're, coming into the schools, and we're trying to reach the youth in a way of, like trying to focus on prevention.
And making the safest choice possible. If you're going to make a choice.
Correct.
Going to take a risk.
Yeah.
How do you make the safest risk possible? I also think too, and I'm thinking about this for a second, I also think there's a shift in terms of the idea around like taking things and putting things in your body. And maybe I might sound like an old lady here for a moment, but I do feel like when I was a young person, I wasn't as comfortable even just taking medicine. Like it wasn't like, you know what I mean? Like this idea of like, oh, okay, maybe if you had a cold or something. But we're also having generations of folks, like I said, I'm 41, but I think of people who are even in their 30s and 20s and late teens right now, of a more medicated culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? That whatever medicine means, it can mean a lot of different things, but that idea of like taking things and putting things in your body to alter the way you're feeling.
Exactly.
There's also a shift in acceptance to that. And like that combination of having more of medicated generations, right? Because I'm meeting more people who are in their late 20s and early 30s, and they've been on some form of medication or in and out of medication for a long time.
Yep.
And there's different comfort level with like, oh, well, maybe I'll just try that.
Sure.
I'll just, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's a shift in being curious and willing to try to alter how your body is feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I mean, for pharmaceutical companies,
Well, yeah, I mean, that could be a whole other podcast.
Yeah,
We could just talk about the selling of drugs.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. And then, how, we could do a whole other podcast on it. But, I like what you said about just like, right, putting something in your body to change the way that you feel. And so I think that, right, like not only does that show up within substance abuse, but also within mental health, right? Because we can be having a lot of feelings that we may not want to feel. And so, we may be putting a substance to mask it, but there's still like a deeper root issue going on. Right?
And there's a different acceptance of that, which I think is great for a lot of reasons, that there is a lot of options on how people can be well. And I think that there's just some new risk that we're learning about that. You know, you don't know unless you try, because yes, people have been using substances for millennia to try to alter our bodies or to change the way that we feel. But there's a little bit of a difference when you can access it in a way so readily and so young.
Yes.
That is, you know, different. And I might sound like an old lady, but I do think there's a little bit of a difference when you might have to figure out how to get your weed to smoke a bowl before a football game or before or after school to help with, I think about our friends that were in high school who probably had some form of stuff going on and they were totally using cannabis to medicate themselves. But it was a little bit harder to get. So there were some other coping or other mechanisms or other things you had to try because you didn't have access to it all the time. And so access is another thing that has 100% shifted the ability to try or use different things to work on how you feel. And so I wonder too, for us, you know, we're raising kids and we're doing this work in the community where that access conversation lives, you know, because we're not really talking about access. And there's so much fear. It's interesting that there's a lot of adults and young people who are really scared, but they also aren't talking about how it's just around you now all the time.
Yeah. I mean, there's literally a dispensary on every corner.
Literally.
I mean, like, just like there's a Starbucks, there's a dispensary. Yeah.
I like now sometimes they're like next to each other.
I mean,
they share
there's
walls.
one. Yeah.
You can like pick up your caffeine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stimulant.
Yeah.
And your cannabis.
Yeah.
And move on with your day.
Yeah.
And there's probably a beer or wine or a liquor store also in the near
trifecta.
Oh yeah, the trifecta, man.
You
can get all the things you need. Ready to go.
Yeah. I mean, accessibility is a huge shift for sure. I myself, as a woman in recovery, I'm very open with my kids, just because, you know, they've seen me go through my stuff. They've been there with me. And so I'm very open about my own recovery, because I think that when we don't talk about it, you know, we're like suffering in silence. And so I think this work is shifting in a way where people are more open to like personal testimonies of people recovering. And I think that you know, there's still, there is still stigma, I think, within certain professional places where it's like, oh, like, you know, you're supposed to be, you know, like keep this certain like professional mask, where it's like, you know, I think when we're dealing with students, clients, right, that are having these issues, not that we do full disclosure, but that we can really kind of have an understanding of like what it's like, because we have been there. And so I think there can be a lot of value in personal testimony, as far as like, you know, just trying to let people know, like, we know what it's like.
Yeah,
you know?
and the sharing, I think, is also interesting because I do think about my adults when I was a young person not talking about what they were doing in high school or college. And my parents were in Berkeley in the 70s. You can say whatever you want. I don't believe any of it. I don't. I have pictures of you half naked, kind of in some sweet disco clothes, going God knows where in Berkeley in the 70s. So like, I would love to know more when you're ready to share, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about any of it. I also think about how much autonomy and freedom they had as a young person, because there was no cell phone, there was no nothing. You were just out and you were doing whatever it is you were doing with your friends, and there wasn't a lot of like reporting back, right? Like it was just we had some of that too, just the safety of silence.
The safety of
maybe silence, a Polaroid, which I'm happy some don't exist. I'm happy those are gone or somewhere in a box that no one will hopefully find. But right, we just didn't have that either. We just had people not talking about it. And so now I think there is this balance of figuring out how do we decrease the stigma and also talk about healthy behaviors, because I drink wine in front of my children, right? You know what I mean? And so they're seeing maybe even an old fashioned from time to time. You know what I mean? And so they're seeing these behaviors with substances, or I make the joke about eating sugar, but I love me a dessert. And so they see me, you know, ritualizing some of the behaviors of things that you do, and like, how do you manage the quantity and the quality of whatever it is that you're going to do. And that is a newer conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
I just think as adults, talking about how we're feeling about it when we're doing it, we're trying to talk about what we're doing and then what it looks like to people who are younger than us. And I'll also give a shout out to the older adults who I think, too, are still trying to manage and care for themselves, coming from a generation of just being silent, right? Like you weren't going to talk about how you were doing or what you needed. You were weak if you couldn't handle whatever. So I feel like right now, I feel like every conversation right now is all about being in the sandwich. Yeah. Where I'm like, okay, we're trying to do things in a different way. I don't know. We'll see how we're doing. I think the verdict's still out on how we're doing as being the adults in charge. But for young folks, I just think that they're getting a way different experience. And then I can't help but bring it up all the time, but social media and our phones bringing awareness to things constantly is also, I think, a challenge, because it brings up a lot of stuff for you when you're ingesting all of that media that you then need to figure out how you're going to do something to regulate yourself. And then you're just the knowing, right? So the past couple weeks here in our county has been a rough couple weeks for young people and the families and the communities that we're a part of. And I don't really know if anybody wants to let us know if the data on this. I'd be happy to know. I don't really know if it's that different or if we just know more. Right? Because in 2001, when we graduated high school, I had no idea how many overdoses were going on in Sonoma County. I don't know where that data lived. We didn't know about severe and persistent mental health stuff going on in the community. We didn't have dispensaries. We didn't have, and there's just a bunch of things we didn't have. So I don't really know if it's more or if it's just more knowing that on a Saturday night, you know, our amazing, full support, all of our emergency first responders are now sharing what they're doing. And so everybody just knows as soon as something really challenging and terrible happens, which is a different way to live with what we're talking about. It's super different. So different. So I think about that too, because me even thinking about it right now sort of makes me want to have a glass of wine at 10:40 in the morning, right? Like it brings up that, like, how do I calm that down? Or some chocolate. I would take either one at this moment. But I just think that that's a real thing. And so I'm wondering too, when you are doing the work, either personally and professionally, how you're seeing those pieces too pop up in a new way.
Yeah. I mean, the opioid epidemic is significant. And so I do think, I definitely think the combination of social media, the accessibility that we have to information, right? Like that's a whole newer lens. But the opioid epidemic has also been, absolutely significant. I read somewhere that there's been more opioid deaths than COVID deaths, and yet more people were talking about COVID as opposed to, specific overdose related deaths. So I do think that they are, that's absolutely significant. I don't know all the current data, numbers necessarily, but so like within the last 2 months, 3 people, 2 family members, and then 1 family friend died. One was alcohol related, the other was opioid related. And so like just within my own close personal circle, and could it be a combination of us, like we're, in our 40s now, right? Like there's all different factors, but there are a lot of substance abuse related deaths. And so I do think that is something that is very real. I believe the data still stands that Sonoma County has the second highest opioid related deaths in the state of California. So San Francisco County, I believe, San Francisco / Alameda County has the highest. We have the second highest. So
just really fascinating. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that I mean, that's not the best PR for Sonoma County, so I could see how we're not highlighting that on the regular.
Yeah.
But I also think that it does speak to the amount of substance-related resources that we have here.
Yeah.
Right? And that is very under-discussed.
Most definitely.
Very
Absolutely.
under-discussed.
It absolutely is. Yeah. And I think because there's such the stark contrast, right? I'll just share this. So yeah, I mean, I think like some people, so within recovery community, like if you cannot use substances normally, it's usually coined that you have an allergy, like you have an allergy. So yes, there are some people that can use substances regularly. They don't end up in jail. They don't end up with, right?
Yeah.
And so a few years ago, my kids and I were invited to a neighbor's party, and the neighbor there kept offering me something to drink. And I said, thank you, but I don't drink. And he's like, no, just one. And I said, and I was just very politely being like I can't do one. And he couldn't wrap his brain around it. And then I was like, I have an allergy to alcohol. And then he was like, oh, okay. And then he kind of stopped. And so he understood that. And so I also think that,
I'm not laughing at the story.
No.
I just think that makes me feel a little uncomfortable in my body that you saying no politely, you couldn't just say no. You had to say you had an allergy.
Yeah. And then as soon as I said I had an allergy, then he accepted it and was like, oh, okay. He could wrap his mind around, okay, you have an allergy. But when I was like, no, I can't have one because the way that I use substances, I don't know one. I only know more. And so, yeah, it was just this kind of psychoeducation where I was like, no, thank you. I'm not trying to disrespect your offer, but I can't have one. And
and you're a grown up, you know what I mean? And you're managing that. And I think that with a lot of skills, Angela, this is not a fair comparison. And you and I can be very professional and gracious and use all of our different skills to talk to people.
Sure.
And it can still be hard, right? I don't have an allergy. I just don't need a lot of extra stimuli to get myself going. I'm one of those people where I'm kind of I haven't been to my edge and I don't want to know what it is because, wow, the things I've done sober are a good example. I knew that about myself. I'm I don't need very much of this. And I think if you grew up around seeing people, right, there's that piece too where sometimes when you grow up around examples that you just learn real early, I don't want that to happen to me.
Yes.
And so you live with using the fear as a reason,
that can be a motivation.
That can be a motivation.
Sure.
It totally can.
Yeah.
Straight fear. So I think about that too, that even if you're just not as into things, and we're grown-ups, and I can have one drink, and sometimes that's not enough, right? There's this, how are we all going to have more?
Yeah.
And we're adults. And I think, people right now, I feel are also going to have to figure out how we're going to support our young folks in the sense that the level of pressure from a lot of different directions is different.
Yes.
Is different. I can't even imagine, it wasn't even like that when we were in college. I can't even imagine being in our 20s and having the level of pressure that it is now because you can make a choice that is then recorded or a photo is taken and then it lives forever places and somebody can repost it or share it or place it somewhere else. You don't have any room to make a mistake or try something, and then people can also manipulate content.
Absolutely.
And then it's not, so that whole domino even existing, and adults too. I mean, I definitely have had some grown-up friends that are I didn't know that person was taking a video of what I was doing. Didn't ask me. And so that level of community safety in risk-taking has also changed. And that is also hard.
Oh, yeah.
is really, really hard. So, like, where are you supposed to take safe risks if everything you do could be shared?
Well, there's constant surveillance.
Woo.
I mean, I remember being back at Sonoma State studying sociology. This was in like 2008, and there was a book that we read about surveillance and how we're in this very and now, I mean, you literally can't go anywhere without there being a camera. You're being recorded going in the building, there's people putting cameras where they shouldn't be, right? So it's like, yeah, I mean, that's a whole other level and layer of documentation.
And I wonder too if it's increasing. I don't know if this is true, but I think about for all people, but if you have an increased level of stress, I'll just use that word, you're going to keep trying to figure out how to decrease the stress.
Yeah.
And if, you try some of the more just, I would say, like lower level safe resources to regulate or keep yourself safe, and those aren't working, it's going to escalate.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it's going to escalate. And that part, too, around whatever gives you some of that break.
Yeah.
So many things that can be addictive are also part of, like, giving you a break. Mm-hmm. Right?
Sure.
You and I, you still run.
Yeah, I was just going to
I don't
put in a plug
I'm
for,
all done.
I'm plug for exercise.
Me and running are officially, I mean, not unless I have to. I'm all done. Walking, I'm back to walking. But I think about, for me, swimming and dancing.
Yes.
I'll do that forever. But there is a straight addiction, also to yoga, like a straight addiction to those three experiences because you do your high afterwards.
Yes.
And I'm straight up into those, swimming, dancing, yoga, and that type of high. And so I think, like, what would happen if those stopped working? Like, what would happen? And I think for people of all ages, it gets to that point where you're like, these other things, they're not going to cut it. And so I need something else.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for me, a big part of why my addiction didn't hit full force until later in life, specifically for me, postpartum, after I had one of my kids, is that I've been an athlete my whole life. So I get that serotonin, dopamine. Exercise has really always been my solution, right? Because it changed the way that I feel. There's all kinds of benefits from exercise. So, like, for me, that's why my disease hit later. And I also think that, like, addiction, drug and alcohol use, they are progressive. So I think sometimes, like, that's a really big piece that I don't think people are talking about at a kind of like general level, is that, okay, like, you may be experimenting when you're young, and then, like, maybe you're having some pretty serious consequences, right? And so the progression of the disease is very real. And so I think even just having, like, psychoeducation of, like, okay, like, if you're, having consequences that are getting more serious, to really, like, consider that you may have that temperament for addiction. I was at a recovery meeting last week, and there was a woman who shared. She said that she was training for the 50-mile Lake Sonoma run. Oh. And she said that she was running, and she said that she was training for that, and that running stopped working for her. And so and she's someone who is in recovery. And it was just interesting to hear that. She said, yeah, she's been sober for a number of years, and that running stopped working. And so I just had to say that because I think that we are in a time where, again, we have so much exposure. We can see news from all over the world. We're just, like, bombarded. And so having, like, social media hygiene, I think, is really important. Like,
social media hygiene. I haven't heard it said that way, but I want to keep that. I don't know exactly. I like all the possibilities of what that could mean. And where did you hear that? Social media hygiene.
I learned that from a phenomenal supervisor, Stephen Clifford. He's an LCSW. I love him. Love you, Stephen. So he told us about that within supervision when he was supervising, and him working with teens specifically of, like, being hygienic about what you're putting in your body. What are you putting in your mind? What are you putting in your spirit? Right. And so creating boundaries of, like, what you are allowing yourselves to see. At the high schools, there's a lot of different, like, fights going on, students bringing weapons, and then, you get all the students and everyone's, like, filming it, and then it's like, oh, do you want to watch this? And it's like, no, don't want to watch it, right? And so, again, it's like there's, just, like, having boundaries with what we are allowing in our system.
Yeah, and that the way going back to the brain and our body a bit, the way dopamine and serotonin work is if you just keep increasing the dumping of that in your body, your body gets used to whatever the new level is, and then it looks for a higher level.
Yes.
Right? So if you don't ever really give it a break to go down, it's just constantly going to want to ratchet it up. And I think that hygiene conversation around like what we're putting in there is really important information that we're going to have to figure out ways through our lifespan about how we're going to talk about it, because it's going to look different depending on what stage you're at. And I also think too that we aren't talking about, I want to be clear, drugs being laced with fentanyl is a massive problem. Huge, huge, huge problem. And I think what happens is when something is laced with fentanyl and somebody goes to the hospital or they die, we get real fixated on the fentanyl, and we're not actually also looking at, well, like, why were you buying cocaine? Right? Like, why were you, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not in a judgment place. I just want to know, like, how and why were you making that choice? And how did you get to that place? And is that what you thought was going to happen? Right? Just to think about the steps of that for people to talk it through. Yeah. It doesn't mean you would have maybe made a different choice. Like, that would have been your choice. And I'm sorry that fentanyl was in the mix. But I do think there's a different level of needing to think through the decisions, because the risks could be different.
Lethal. Absolutely lethal. Yeah.
And I found myself saying, this could be totally unpopular opinion, but I found myself saying, like, I just kind of want teenagers going back to drinking. Like, I know that's what my desperate mom voice said, because I was like, at least that somebody's regulating that. Like, there's some form of, not that you can't make your own alcohol at your own house, and a lot of people have that option here in this county, but there's like I found myself feeling like that was a safer choice, right? And because there's some form of protection or regulation of it in my mind is a higher safety, and that drugs right now, if you're buying illegal, use that word, illegal drugs, the risk is super high. Super high. I have a colleague in San Francisco who is working with the San Francisco Fire Department right now, who in the area predominantly of the Tenderloin, they're Narcanning anywhere from 50 to 100 people a day. And I'm like, that's a lot of calls or support for Narcanning people, and that is a different level of just concern.
Oh, absolutely.
In general.
Yeah.
And so I just think, like, I want to make sure too, like, that part of the story also gets discussed. Like, how are people getting to the choices that they're getting to?
Yeah. Well, and now, like, it's usually taking multiple Narcans. Like, it's one Narcan's not usually working, so it's taking 2, 3, or 4.
That's a lot of Narcan.
Yes. When I was working at a women's residential treatment center, we did substance use testing of the clients that were there. And the agency that we used was called Millennium Health. And so there was a lady affiliated with Millennium, and she would take us out to dinner like every 6 months. And she'd do a presentation on these like within the U.S., Canada, I think it was even like globally, trends in substance abuse. So there's certain substances that are like basically like circling, and so carfentanil is way more potent than fentanyl, right? And so she was showing us the research and the stats of drug-related deaths and kind of how like things are shifting with how drugs are getting into the United States, and how there are trends of like different substances. And there's also other substances that are coming in that are not fentanyl, but that are mimicking fentanyl, and that Narcan's not necessarily working.
Yeah, because science is real. And there's a lot of technology that now can be used to create things that haven't even been created yet, right? That's also the part that we're balancing. And yeah, I did. I just found myself hoping my kids would like go to a field with a keg. Like, I miss the days. I'm like, that's like, you know what I mean? And that might sound like silly romanticizing, but I do think that that was an area of teenagehood where I knew when I went to something like that, somebody might throw up. Maybe there'd be too much beer. People might get caught. But I didn't have to think about Narcan or test strips. You know, and I think that is a level of stress that we're putting on our young folks and people in our community that is changing. It's changing things. And then sometimes when I talk to young people, they're like, what do you mean a keg in a field? And I'm like, okay, that's a whole nother story for another time. But and that's even talking to people in their 20s. They're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, yeah, we weren't there wasn't a lot of drug use. I mean, it was mainly alcohol and weed. Like that was mainly what we were exposed to. And now I think there is a shift between prescription drugs, harder illegal substances, access to cannabis that you can eat on a regular basis. And so that whole culture generationally is shifting. I also was talking to some folks the other day too about drugs, predominantly like acid being in stickers, right? And I was like, that's an interesting scientific thought that I had never had, that you can get a sticker with enough acid concentration on it and they just put it on. And it's not a very big sticker. I was like, oh, a sticker. Nope, it's not that big. It's like the size of a dime. And you can put those on your body and have other substances get into your bloodstream through a sticker. That is technology that if it did exist when we were younger, people weren't using it for that. And so I think that piece too around the unchartedness of where we're going is important. And what are we going to do to support each other is, I think, partly too the part that I get hopeful about, and I'm like, what do we do next? And I do think we need more spaces for people to just talk about it and ask questions. I think there's a lot of questions people have, and I'm not saying going to the internet is bad, but sometimes it's not the best, and it doesn't allow for dialogue. And I think that's a lot of what people are missing too, is the dialogue about the topic. Yeah. So I'm wondering too, if you were to, I don't know, wish for some things that we were doing in our community, or you're doing for yourself, what would it look like? What would it feel like?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's something to like creating spaces where people can like feel safe to talk about all of these issues. I mean, in addition to like opioid related deaths, I mean, there are tons of people losing their lives to alcohol. And so, I mean, I just want to put in a plug where, there are a lot of people dying from like DUI related deaths. There are, there was a woman within the recovery community that lost her life earlier this year to a drunk driver, and she had been sober for a number of years. And so I also think like, even within alcohol, it is so normalized. It's in the media, it's in movies, it's in shows. And so, I think that there is a lot of danger in something being so normalized, and that then when people question it or like want to talk about the harm, like I mean, alcohol is just a much of is a drug. And so again, I think because it is so, and it's portrayed, in such a way.
It can be casual.
I mean, it is, well, and it's also this, I mean, people are here wine tasting. And so it becomes this kind of like classist, right, thing. And when, like really, I mean, it's, and I say this as someone who, I mean, I was raised in a Irish family, and so alcoholism, I wish it was just a stereotype, but it's not. There's severe alcoholism on both sides of my family, and so I think, again, like there's like a normalization, and so I think to really like to be like open-minded, honest, and like willing to have dialogue with people, and then I guess. I mean, probably my biggest wish is that, like we stop losing our kids in this community to substances. And so I think through prevention, and I mean, I think it'd be great if like wineries, breweries, cannabis dispensaries, right? Like even some like warnings, right? Of, like just because again, like these are industries that are making a ton of money. And yet, when like people fall prey to these industries, there can be some really deadly consequences. So I just think like, again, it's not black or white. There's a lot of nuance. And so how can we like warn youth about the risks?
I just want to thank you for bringing up the point around normalization, because I do feel like we have the spectrum of acceptable addictions.
Exactly.
Right? There's the whole range of like what's acceptable.
Yeah.
And that piece around whatever is not acceptable or dark or scary or dirty. There's lots of words that get used, right? That gets a different type of attention than acceptable types of addiction.
Yes.
And how that and maybe we could even go a softer word than addiction, but just having usage or experiences with things that have risk, and like just not even talking about the risk,
exactly,
right? Because it's almost like packaged as like it's almost risk free. You'll be fine, and that's an important spectrum to remember. That like what is acceptable and what is not, and how is it packaged, and what are some of the consequences of that?
Yes, absolutely. And what you were talking about earlier, you're mentioning about how like a lot more folks are taking different kinds of medication, right? Again, how are these substances interacting with one another? That's another thing that I don't think people really are necessarily researching, right? If you're on SSRI medication, and maybe you're on another medication, and then you're drinking a super strong beer, right? That's like, again, and then if you're ingesting cannabis. So it's also like how all these substances are then like intersecting, because again, like you may think that you're using normally or you know how to handle it, but like
we're doing some experimenting.
We're definitely
let's just doing some experimenting.
Straight up, like people
straight up.
Right?
We do not. I know. We do not have enough information to know. And I also think, to your point, if it's labeled as accessible, we don't have any reasons to question it. Right? Yeah. If it's approved by whoever.
Sure. All kinds of things have been approved, and then they recall them after, right?
It's like, this is approved, and it's fine, so we're not going to question it. And I think, we need to get into a place of just questioning and supporting each other and thinking about what we're going to do with the level of access, information, and I feel like a much broader umbrella of options. Yeah. Just so many more options. Yeah. Than we've ever had before. And we're not really dialoguing about that.
No, absolutely not. And like people have different constitutions, temperaments, DNA, right? Like there's just so many things I think that come into play when people are putting substances in their body and just like not knowing, right? Like you may have a kind of allergy come up later, and so. Yeah, depending on our family of origin and like how long our family has been using a certain substance. Like, I also just want to put in a plug for Sonoma County Indian Health Project. I used to work in their behavioral health department. They have MAT services. So, within this community too, like there are specific communities that are being even more impacted because they're like smaller population, but that are really being impacted by SUD-related issues. And so, again, I think like within Sonoma County, there are a ton of Sonoma County tribes that are in this area, and so again, I think the media is like really focused on like what Sonoma County. Oh, we have all this money, and when really like there are specific marginalized communities that are being really deeply impacted by SUD-related issues. So I just wanted to put a plug in for that too.
I mean, I don't think that we are giving, as often as we should, giving a fuller picture and scope of the massive Venn diagram that you and I are talking about right now. Yes. It'd be a big ass Venn diagram. Oh, yeah. But I do think that we have to start putting those pieces together and talking about it, because and I think the talking about it is really important. And my wish is the action, right? So like, what are we going to do? And try.
Yeah.
Like, I think like that's the other part too, where there's a lot of that worry about making a mistake and like the perfectionism around like trying to help. And we need to start trying different things and seeing how it goes. Or we're just, to your point, kind of be circling, right? We're not actually going to work on anything and see what happens. And we have to be able to pivot because things keep getting added to the Venn diagram.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's my wish is how do we, in small and in larger ways, try some things. And I think you being here today and being willing to have a conversation with me on a podcast while also being filmed is an example of how do we do more of that? Like, how do we get more people being willing to discuss and do? And you and I we're probably sometimes doing too much, but we're trying to do things. And I think that is important. And that piece, especially when you're in a time of, I don't know, the past couple weeks have been rough.
Yeah.
What are we going to also use to charge us to try?
Yeah. Yeah.
And people keep saying, well, what are we going to do? And I'm like, well, we need to start somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in social work, we always say, like, lean into the discomfort, right? It may be uncomfortable. It's going to be progress, not perfection, right? It's going to be messy, but to, like, lean into that and be like, okay, we may have some kind of, like, clunky conversations that may feel awkward, but again, it's like we need to speak to these issues and
do some stuff.
And actually,
Maybe the 3 things you just said we should, like, have on stickers everywhere we go.
Recovery has all kinds of
I know,
great phrases. I just
think leaning into discomfort and it may be messy, but those are not reasons to not try. And I think that's where we need to go. And so I just appreciate you coming and talking, and we are going to do what we can do. And I just appreciate you taking a risk and sharing and being here. And so thank you so much for coming today.
It's an honor to be here.
All right, thanks. You've been listening to Key to the Bridge, a podcast brought to you by your friends at Keystone Therapy and Training Services. I'm your host, Erica Bosque. Key to the Bridge is recorded and produced by Jeff Henderson and Brian Henderson. This is a podcast for everyone.